and sisters, this story of David and Goliath is a very common and popular story. It is one of the more popular stories that comes out of the biblical text. In fact, it has become so popular that we use the phrase David versus Goliath anytime an underdog is facing somebody who is clearly and obviously better than them. My brothers and sisters, and so often this text has been read and sermons have been preached on this text that talk about the radical faith of a little shepherd boy who had no business on a battlefield, let alone with an experienced warrior, and how this boy with no experience stepped onto a field against a giant that should have killed him, and how God miraculously turned things in favor of the shepherd boy. And people have run and jumped and shouted and praised God as they have thought about their own situations in which they are outmatched, and praying that God would deliver them in the same way that God delivered David. And my brothers and sisters, it's a great story, and it has a great message. The only problem is that's not what happened at all. That we have misread this text for so long. Wow. And in misreading the text, we fail to understand what happened at this battle. And if we don't understand what happened in the battle, then we can't understand how to apply this biblical truth to our lives. Amen. When we look at this, what is happening, my brothers and sisters, I want to tell you that nothing in this picture is as it seems. Everything is different. The battle scene opens as the Philistines are gathering on one side of the mountain, and the armies of Israel were gathering on the other side of the mountain. And if you know anything about biblical history, you will know that Saul was chosen to be the head of the armies of Israel because Saul was the biggest and the strongest of the Israelites. Saul was their physical champion. And so they chose him to be the leader because he looked like he should be in charge. And so as they were gathering to fight, and Saul is leading the army, there comes from the Philistines somebody who is bigger and stronger than Saul. The measurements in the version that we read are a little hard to understand. But if we would translate them into measurements that we would be more familiar with, the Bible it indicates that Goliath stood about 10 feet tall, that his spear, the tip of his spear alone weighed 15 pounds, that his armor weighed 126 pounds, and that he stood and walked carrying this armor on his body, carrying these weapons with him as he went out to battle. Can you imagine what it would look like if when the Bengals lined up against the Chargers in a couple of hours, that the Chargers had somebody in their backfield that was 10 feet tall and whose football gear weighed 126 pounds. you might fear for the Bengals' chances in the football game, let alone when it is a one-on-one fight. And so you can understand why Saul's heart would sink, as Saul should be the one, as the leader of the Israelites, who goes out to fight. But when he sees this 10-foot-tall giant standing in front of him, his heart begins to sink within him, my brothers and sisters. But I told you, nothing is as it seems in here. And the first thing you have to realize is that Goliath is really not as bad as he seems to be. My brothers and sisters, there are a few things, and if it were just one of them, it might just be coincidence. But when you lay these things over one another, you get a clearer picture of who Goliath really is. The first thing is, let's just be honest about it. People don't grow to be 10 feet tall. It just doesn't happen. Even in today's world, we don't see many people who grow to be that tall. So the fact that Goliath, in a world where other people were not growing to be this tall, is that tall, indicates that something is amiss. There is a condition, a physical condition, that causes rapid and uncontrollable growth. Your body has a gland that sends hormones throughout your body that tells your body it's time to grow. And at a certain point, it tells your body it's time to stop. And that determines how tall or short you are. But there are certain people who have a malfunction in this gland, that it does not turn off when it's time to turn off. And so they keep growing uncontrollably. The challenge is the reason why these individuals are not known to us, and the reason why we don't see them in places like the NBA or the NFL, where they could make use of their amazingly abnormal height, is because it also provides an extreme set of limitations. They tend to be more clumsy. It's hard for them to walk. They tend to be extremely nearsighted, able only to see what is in front of them, and suffering from blurred or multiple vision when it comes to things on the outside of their immediate reach. Now, if you look at the text indicates that Goliath suffered from some of these conditions. The first thing you need to know is that when it came to the type of battle that Goliath was wanting to engage, that he was proposing to engage in with the people of Israel, the one-on-one, mano-a-mano, the best fighters in the middle of the ring, duking it out for the entire army, that any soldier who would have fought with his hands, with a sword, with a spear, would have carried his own shield. Because when you're in a battle, you don't have time for somebody else to carry your shield for you. The only people who had somebody carry a shield for them would have been archers. Because archers needed both of their hands free to be able to maneuver the bows and the arrows. But the infantry soldiers, the hand-to-hand combat soldiers, always would carry their own shield because they needed to be able to protect themselves at all times from anyone who would attack them. The Bible says that Goliath has a shield bearer. And not only does he have a shield bearer, but he has a shield bearer who walks before him. It is an indication that maybe Goliath needs help finding the place on the battlefield where he's supposed to go. He needs somebody to guide him, to place him where he needs to stand. Perhaps Goliath can't make it there on his own. And so he has a shield bearer where he ought not have a shield bearer with him. The other thing, my brothers and sisters, that we see is the Bible is very clear about what David does when David walks out onto the battlefield. The Bible says David takes his staff and gets 5 stones and walks out into the battlefield. But Goliath says, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" David has 1 staff and 5 stones. And Goliath says, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" Plural.
Deborah's in the building.
Goliath sees multiple sticks where David only has 1. It is an indication that Goliath can't see as clear as one might want to when one is engaging in battle. But there's another thing that Goliath says. When Goliath is talking to David, Goliath says to David, "Come to me so that I can feed your flesh to the birds." Now, I don't know a lot about fighting. I've never been a fighter. But I do know one thing about advantage. And that is, when you have an advantage, you want to take your advantage to your opponent. If I am bigger and stronger, you all know I played basketball. And when I played basketball, occasionally I played against people who were smaller than me. And so I knew when I had somebody that was smaller than me, what I wanted to do was get as close to them as possible and put my body on their body so that I could back them down, because with me being bigger and stronger, they could not stop me as long as I was in contact with them. And so if Goliath had the size advantage on little David, Goliath would have close the distance between him and David as quickly as possible to take advantage of his strength. But that Goliath is asking David to come to me so that I can feed your flesh to the birds indicates that maybe Goliath can't go to David. Because maybe Goliath can't really see where David is. He sees more than one person with more than 1 stick. And so he doesn't know where to go to find David. So he wants David to come to him where he can use his advantage. My brothers and sisters, Goliath isn't all that he seems to be. Now, the interesting thing is that I think David had it figured out. I think David saw Goliath's weaknesses. The people of Israel didn't see it because they were so intimidated by what Goliath looked like that fear shut down their ability to notice what was really happening, my brothers and sisters. And I say that simply to say that I know we have giants in our lives. But your Goliath is not as bad as it seems to be. Your giant is not as tough as it seems to be. Your obstacle is not as insurmountable as it seems to be. But as long as you sit back in fear, running and hiding from your giant, because you are afraid of its bark, you will never realize, my brothers and sisters, that your giant actually has a weakness. It actually has a disadvantage. I was playing basketball. I was playing basketball with my pastor in St. Louis, and we had a team of guys from the church. And my pastor was a little taller than me, a lot broader than me. He was actually about the size I am now then, and I was skinny as a rail. I was about that big back then, and we were the 2 best players and the only 2 really good players on the team.
And then everybody else had a lot of enthusiasm. And some of them had a lot of energy, but not a lot of skill. And we were playing another church, my brothers and sisters, and this church did not see basketball as a way of bonding with the men of the church. They saw it as a way of recruiting other outside people to come and play for the church. And so we actually talked to the guys and asked them what church they go to, and they admitted to us they did not go to church. That they were a traveling team that was hired by the church to play in the church league. So we're going out playing against the traveling team. It's me and my pastor and a bunch of guys that are just out there with good hearts, and some of them with some energy, and we're playing against this team, and they are dunking the ball, they're doing 360s, they're shooting from everywhere, and halftime comes and we're down by 30 points. And as much as I am confident in my skills, there's no way that we can win this fight. And the pastor brings us to the sideline and he says, "Gentlemen, we got them right where we want them." Pastor, I love you, but you have got to be out of your mind. There's no way we can win this game. And he says, no, we actually can win. They've got some skills, but they don't know really how to play basketball. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to play zone defense, and we're going to pack it in the middle. And they're not going to drive, and they're not going to get any more layups or dunks. We're going to make them pass the ball and shoot over us. And we will get the rebound, and we're going to take our time and pound the ball inside and use our advantage over them. And wouldn't you know it, in the last 30 seconds of the game, we had come back from being down by 30 to being down by 3. And our pastor gets the ball in the post down by 3. And they foul him. And he gets to the free throw line and makes 2 free throws. So we're down by 1 and they have 30 seconds left. And pastor says, "Gentlemen, I told you we had them right where we wanted them. Now this is what we're going to do. Nelson, you and Charles, you all are the quickest out here. So as soon as they inbound the ball, I want you to trap the guy. And he's going to freeze up because we haven't trapped them all game. And he's going to try to make a pass that he shouldn't make. And I want you to get your hands active because the ball's going to be free and we're going to get a steal. And as soon as we get the ball, call a timeout." And it happened just the way my pastor set it up. We trapped them. They threw the ball away. We called a timeout. And so pastor said, "Nelson, I want you to take the ball down the court and you'll know what to do." And so I get the ball in and I'm going down the court and the time is running out. And I'm looking for my pastor because he's been leading us the whole way. But they've got 3 people on him. And I've got 2 people behind me who had the willingness but did not have the energy to keep up. And so I have 2 people behind me. My pastor has 3 people on him. And there's this little guy, his name was Marvin. And Marvin was 16 years old and had the energy but had absolutely no skill whatsoever. Marvin hadn't even made a shot during warm-ups. But he's the only person that's open. And so I say to myself, I say, "God, if you've ever been with us, be with Marvin right now." As I throw Marvin the ball, and I throw it to him, and Marvin has a clear path. There's nothing between him and the basket. And nobody's even running to him because they don't believe he can make a basket. But Marvin doesn't move to the basket. Marvin takes a step, and it looks like he trips over the ground. And he just throws the ball up in the air. And when he threw the ball up in the air, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is how we're going to lose the game. But somehow the ball found the basket. And it just rolled around the basket. And it just kept rolling, and everybody's watching the ball roll, and it seemed like it rolled for an hour. Just around, and finally the ball drops in. And we go and we shout. And we were excited because we didn't think we could win. But my pastor knew that the team was not as good as we thought. thought they were. They were a lot of show, but they were not as talented as we made them out to be, my brothers and sisters. And when we believed that we could win, we started playing. And what I'm trying to say, my brothers and sisters, is that the challenges that are in front of you that seem to be big, that seem to be threatening and intimidating, are not as bad as they seem. And if you can just not be afraid, and not hide and not run, but stare down your challenges, you will begin to see that they're not as bad as you thought they were. But not only is Goliath not what he seems, my brothers and sisters, but David is not what he seems. For we have believed David to have been an outmatched shepherd who had no place on the battlefield. But actually, there were several types of warriors that would fight at the time. There were infantry, people like Goliath who fought hand to hand. There were types of cavalry, people who would ride on horses or other animals and would fight on the animals. And then there were artillery fighters. Often there were archers, but before there were bows and arrows, they were called projectile warriors. They were warriors who were trained to throw rocks and to use rocks as weapons against people. Legends of battle said that trained projectile warriors were so accurate that they could hit a bird flying in the air in mid-flight. And in places in the world where people actually still fight with projectiles, they have estimated that a trained projectile warrior can shoot a rock at 100 yards and have the same impact as a 9mm bullet hitting somebody. So projectile warriors were actually very lethal and very dangerous and very important if you were in battle. Now, like it is today, we have the Boy Scouts, and one of the main purposes of Boy Scouts is to prepare young men to be able to go into the military, to give them the type of survival skills that would be necessary so that they would be prepared at a young age for military service. In this time, they would train their young men to learn fighting skills before it was time for them to go into the army. Now, the fact is that David, unlike Saul, does not have imposing physical strength or size. So any father with his son would have realized that if his son was going to survive in the army, that it was not going to be fighting people hand to hand. That David had to use his size to his advantage. And so, as Jesse sends David out to be a shepherd, that part of David's training would have involved using projectiles against the animals to defend the sheep. My brothers and sisters, that shepherds would not have been taught how to fight hand to hand, but were taught to use projectiles. Because if an animal has your sheep and is running away, the chances of you catching the animal are slim. But if you can take a rock and put it in a sling and can aim that rock and hit the animal while it's running, that you can strike down the animal and hurt it or kill it before it leaves with your sheep. So that as part of David's training as a shepherd would have been how to use a rock and a sling in order to protect his sheep. The other reason why that training would have been important, because everybody would have had to have been in the military at some point in time or another. So David's time was going to come, even if it wasn't now. And when he went into the military, if he had training on how to use a projectile, then when it was time to fight, then he would be among the people using the projectiles to fight so that he would not have to fight hand to hand. My brothers and sisters, So as David is walking out onto the battle, David is not walking out without a set of skills, but David realizes the skill set he has and knows that he can fight Goliath using his skill set. My brothers and sisters, what I'm simply trying to say is that not only is your giant not as tough as it seems to be, but you aren't as weak as you imagine yourself to be. My brothers and sisters, that you might not have the same strength that your giant has. You might not have the same skill set or talents as your neighbor has. But God has given you a set of skills, my brothers and sisters. God has given you a gift. You might not have the degrees that somebody else has, but God has given you a mind. And if you use the mind that God has given you, my brothers and sisters, then you are equipped for the battle. You might not be as talented as somebody else is, but God has given you a set of talents, my brothers and sisters. And what we have to do is recognize what God has given us and then develop the skills that God has given us and use those and practice those to perfection so that we can be the best at what God has called us to be. If I am trying to be somebody else, I will always be no better than second at being somebody else. But I can be the best Nelson Pierce Jr. that the world has ever seen. My brothers and sisters, God has given you a set of skills, and if you stop trying to be like other people and do what other people do and recognize what God has given you and use the skills that God has given you to the best, then you can show a force on the world that nobody has ever seen before and nobody will ever see again. My brothers and sisters, David knew that David had a set of skills and he was practicing those skills out in the valley. Now this is the other point, my brothers and sisters, that before David fought Goliath, David was in the valley fighting with sheep, doing a job that nobody else wanted to do, but that provided him the opportunity to practice the skills necessary so that when he got onto the battlefield with Goliath, he was the best equipped to fight Goliath, my brothers and sisters. And so what I'm saying is, where you might be in your life right now, it may seem like you're out tending a few sheep, doing something that nobody's celebrating you for doing, where nobody's applauding you for what you're doing, where nobody's patting you on the back or congratulating you for what you're doing. But if you use the skills that God has given you and develop and harness those skills in the valley with your sheep, when it's time to fight Goliath, my brothers and sisters, you will be the best able to fight Goliath because you will have practiced a set of skills when nobody else was watching or paying attention or minding what you did, my brothers and sisters. David was ready to fight Goliath because David had been faithful with the sheep. So whatever skills God has given you and wherever God has placed you, use and develop those skills now, because, my brothers and sisters, we need you because Goliath is coming and we need you to be able to use your skills to fight Goliath. Goliath is not as tough as he seems to be. And David is not as weak as he seems to be. Now, the last thing, my brothers and sisters, that is not what it seems, is that there was a social convention about how to fight. This type of battle that Goliath wanted to fight, there was a social convention about how to do it. And the social convention was simply that you would go down into the battle with your shield and your sword, and you would stand in the middle of the battle, and you would stand and fight with your sword and your shield until somebody won. And every respectable soldier would have known and would have adhered to this convention, even if they knew they could not win, because the social convention of being in an army mandates that you fight the way you're supposed to fight. But David isn't in the army. David wasn't allowed to be in the army. So David didn't care about their social convention. not only that, my brothers and sisters, but David wasn't even from a prominent family in Israel. Before David became king, nobody cared about anybody from Bethlehem. It was a poor farmer's town where nobody important came from. That David was an unimportant person. He was the least important person in an unimportant family from an unimportant part of the town. Wasn't even old enough or strong enough to get into the army. So David has nothing, he has no stake in the established social convention. And so when Saul tries to place on David Saul's armor, because Saul believes that David is going to fight the battle the way Saul would have fought the battle, David takes Saul's armor off and says, I can't work with this because I can't fight it the way you want me to fight it. I don't care about the convention. What I care about is beating this giant. And so I'm willing to change the rules of how we fight in order to defeat the giant. Now, my brothers and sisters, I just believe that because Goliath can't see, he doesn't know what's about to happen to him. But everybody else on the mountain, on both sides of the mountain, know what's about to happen. They know that as David is reaching in his pouch for a stone, and as he's winding up that sling, that no matter how strong Goliath is, he doesn't have a chance. Because Goliath standing there in his 126 pounds of armor with his 15-pound spear isn't going to stop this bullet that's going to come out of David's sling aiming for his head. And because David is practiced at it, David's not going to miss, my brothers and sisters. The reason that David wins is that David does not care about the rules of the fight. David just cares about the outcome of the fight. And so David is willing to break the giant's rules to fight on his terms, my brothers and sisters. And so what I'm saying is, when you engage in your fight against your giant, don't fight on your giant's terms. Don't fight to your giant's strengths, but fight to the strengths that God has given you. My brothers and sisters, if we had been playing basketball and played the way the guys wanted us to play, they'd still be dunking on us today. But we were able to win because we knew our strengths and we were able to play to our strengths, my brothers and sisters. If the civil rights movement had engaged in changing politics the way everybody wanted them to change politics, we still would be living in segregation today. But they changed the rules because they realized that they did not have any investment in the rules as they were established, my brothers and sisters. There is nothing, and what David realizes that we also have to realize is that God did not care about the giant's rules. That there is nothing holy about following the giant's rules, because the giant's rules were designed for the giant to win. And because we know in the biblical text that God is never on the side of the giants, but God is always on the side of the people who are oppressed, my brothers and sisters, that God does not care about the giant's rules. So we don't get any holy points with God by playing the game the way the giant wants us to play. But actually, my brothers and sisters, what God had been preparing David all along was to be able to use these set of skills that were outside of the box, that were outside of the convention, to be able to fight and take down Goliath. What I'm simply trying to say, my brothers and sisters, is that when you feel like you are left out, when you feel like you are pushed away, when you feel like you are an outsider, that is not a reason to be upset, but it's actually a reason to give God praise.